My name is Oliver Nelson. I'm a Senior Technologist at Mertech Data Systems, and I'll be doing our presentation today on our new release of Flex2SQL 12.1. And you'll see here we've gone with the title of Big Features in a Minor Release, and that's definitely the case with Flex2SQL 12.1. There's lots of changes that we've made to add features into the driver for various things that people have asked for quite some time now, actually. One of the features we actually showed a preview of in our last Campfire is SQL Azure. Now, SQL Azure is basically Microsoft's cloud computing environment, and they offer a database system as part of it, the SQL part of it. And so we've gone ahead and added in support in the driver so that you can access SQL Azure databases from your Visual DataFlex or DataFlex application. I want to show you what that looked like real quick. So the way I'm demoing this is from a Azure virtual machine. That's another one of the services provided. You can get a lot more details about all the services and how they work together from our last Campfire, so I won't go into too much detail on that here. But I've got the order entry example running here, and you can see in here that we are connecting to this really odd sort of database string here, and that's how SQL Azure supports connecting from the internet. So in this case, one of the reasons I'm running on an Azure VM is so that we have a very small delay time between the round trip from the virtual machine to the server. Since this is run in the same data warehouse, it makes it quite a bit faster. If you actually go and access an Azure database remotely on the internet, there's a lot more round trip time involved, and so the application can be a bit slower. But loading the order entry demo, you can see I've already done a login there, and this is the order entry demo running against a SQL Azure database. So Microsoft has made quite a few changes to SQL Azure. And those changes affected some of the ways that we connect in the driver and deal with various situations from the standpoint of Visual DataFlex. So there definitely is some adjustments that needed to be made to optimize Azure, and so we've gone through and done that. Now, the Azure support right now is again, like the rest of the driver, in beta. So there's going to be some changes improving support for that in the coming weeks, actually. So, but initially you can connect to Azure right now from Visual DataFlex. So that was one of our first big features that we added in here. And in fact, if we look at this a bit more, you can run your application with no code changes other than your login string from Azure. And kind of the benefit to this, Azure actually, they've been adding in some support for faster databases since the last time we spoke about it. So you actually have a couple different tiers, speed tiers for your Azure database, so that if you wanted to run a larger or faster database on it. I had mentioned before in the last webinar that it seemed a little bit slow overall, and Microsoft has gone and changed things since just a few weeks ago and made that offering much more appealing from a speed standpoint. So anyways, if you'd like to know more about that piece, definitely take a look at our prior Campfire, but the current beta has some information in some of our help files on how to use Azure. The next feature we've added in is related to UUIDs, or what's commonly referred to as GUIDs. Now, Mertech has actually had GUID column support for a few versions now, but it was something that not a lot of people were using. And one of the reasons is that GUIDs really come into themselves in the form of their use as primary keys. So with this new support, we expect people to get on the GUID bandwagon, so to speak. Now, the support that we've added in relation to these primary keys is for MS SQL, Oracle, and PostgreSQL. And let me show these to you before we get into them anymore to kind of show you what this is. So we're going to go in here and create, rather than demoing this from the migration utility. We're actually going to show you how to, at the same time here, we're going to use SQL Server Management Studio to create a table and then connect to it from the migration utility. We're going to do things the other way around from what you're used to. And again, we're in the order entry example, and we're going to create just a simple login table here. The data type that you use for this is unique identifier, and it is supported natively in the 12.1 driver as a primary key. Now, to make this all work right, what we're doing here is we're making it so that if you use a unique identifier, you have the ability to come down into the properties here, and there's this option that you can set in here, and all of the PostgreSQL and Oracle also have a similar option to this, where I can tell it that this column is a row GUID. And if I look at what this actually does, you'll see it assigns a default value to this field of new ID. And that's really the key to this. What ends up happening is when you go to save a row, if there's no data in that in this column, in the login ID column, it'll get assigned a default value by the server, and that value will get passed back to the driver. And so if that is your primary key on the table, in prior versions you weren't able to see that, and now that gets passed back all the way into your VDF application so that that record can get refound, and you can use this as your primary key. So let's just add a couple more. And we're also going to show one other thing in here. This default value thing, a lot of people don't use it, but it works out real well for things like storing a created on. In fact, I'm going to add a default value of getDate, which will write in the current date timestamp. It'll basically timestamp this this row for me in here. So the other thing that I've done is, if you saw me in here, I went in here and I set it as a primary key for this column. So we're going to save this, and we're just going to call it login. And then we're going to come over here and set up some indexes. So you can see here, when I do it this way, I actually end up with a primary key login clustered on that index. That's one possible way of handling the situation. Another thing that I can do if I were to go in and remove that and save it and remove this index, oh, did it on its own here. Okay, so we are going to create our own clustered index instead. And so that's fine. We're going to create a cluster. Now, a clustered index, you only get one clustered index per table, and basically it's the order that the data in the table is stored in to match the index. So a lot of times it can help to optimize it by picking something that you may want to be sorted by, such as in this case, the username would be a good table to go for in this case. Now, the login ID ends up being something that you may not want to cluster on, because login IDs are random, and there's all this stuff related to having to insert them all the time because you don't know where they're going to appear, since it's a random GUID that gets assigned there. So this is one of the ways that you can actually optimize your data in relation to this. On most tables, you're never going to see the effects of this. I'm just kind of showing you an ideal method to set it up by. And then we're going to set up another index, a non-clustered on login ID. And then we're going to do one other little change here. Now I'm kind of doing this a little bit backwards. There we go. Okay, by setting it primary key, I'm just, in this case, I'm just going to help DataFlex, help the driver figure out which index to use real quick. Okay, so now I'm in the migration utility, the order entry example, and I'm going to use this feature in here under the generate int option, and I'm going to tell it to bring in our login table that we just created on the server. So it spotted that I don't have that one in my file list, and so I'm just going to bring that in. I'm having some issue here. Okay, here. It doesn't seem to be working for me right now. Let me pick a different file list real quick. I have something locked on that one. Oh, let's just go into our wine inventory one. Okay, we'll give it one more try here. There we go. Now I got it. Okay, just needed to reopen. Okay, so now I'm going to pull this up in Database Explorer. And I'm going to illustrate how this works to you here. So this is a great place to illustrate it, actually, because we end up with just a standard grid in this case. And grids, as you know, if the data doesn't come back right, they tend to have problems. And so in this case, I'm only going to fill in these two columns. And you'll see here that I got my login ID, I got my and my created on date. So if I go in here and fill in Riaz, there's my login ID. So this data is automatically coming back from the server without any work from the developer. So it just works in this case. And one of the nice things about it is if we go in and look at my index arrangement, it sees login ID is the first index, username is the second index. One of the nice things about the implementation that we have is that since login IDs are treated on the Visual DataFlex side as if they are strings, it makes it really easy to do a find on them. So if we were to, for instance, we're going to copy that onto the clipboard, clear it out here. And we're actually going to go in here and tweak the string a little bit. You can do a find directly on, there we go. you can do a find directly on the login ID as it is. As a string value, and it will find the data. So in other words, I can put in, I just have to put it in this format, and I can go and do that find as if it is a string value, even though in the database, if you look at it, it is stored a login ID, a unique identifier. If you look up the actual internal data type for that, it's a 16 character numeric value, essentially, is what it is. So it's a 128-bit value, but it's treated in Visual Data Flex as if it is a string. So that's what GUIDs look like. Now, why might you want to use a GUI? Well, there's a few reasons that this ends up being something you'll want to take a look at. One of them is that if you're using, if you ever have a situation where you need to merge two copies of a table, it ends up being really useful to have a GUID column in there because it ends up giving you your uniqueness no matter what. GUIDs, the generation of GUIDs has a very, 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 very low collision rate. You'll find information like every person, every IP address on the internet could generate one GUID per second for 1,000 years without having a collision. So essentially, you don't have to code for collisions for this at all. It's not advised that you do any coding for collisions in relation to UUIDs, which means that you don't have to worry about merging tables having a collision at all. So it ends up being very useful in that situation. And because internally it is a 128-bit integer value, it's not that much larger from an index perspective. One of the other reasons to use it is that it gives you the ability to do replication of your database. In fact, a lot of database systems require that you have a UUID column for replication. And if you have a situation where a database, where you have distributed databases, in general, it just helps to not have to worry about synchronizing a sequence or something like that across multiple servers. One of the other things to think about in relation to it is that although in this case I set it up as a default value, and that's really what we've added support for in the driver, I didn't have to do that. I could have generated it on the client side as well. I could have done it in the data dictionary without any problem at all. And that ends up being another advantage of this. GUIDs are actually pretty easy to generate, and they can be generated wherever. So if, for instance, you didn't want to have it generated at the server side, wanted it at the client side, any of your clients can use standard GUID generation, and you never have to worry about a collision. So it can deal with situations where you may have like a, if you had a table that has a large number of inserts to it, has a lot of activity, sometimes you can have basically a starvation situation in relation to an identity or a sequence. And because these are all generated at the client side, if you set it up that way, you get rid of that problem entirely. Although even the way we've set it up with a default value, since they're not using a single resource on the server to do it, you don't have that starvation issue either. So primary keys end up being somewhat of a complicated issue. There are some resources out here that I've used to kind of help me along the way in working with primary keys. A lot of the advice you'll find on them starts back in like 2002 and comes forward from there. And there's a few different ways of making the decision on your primary key, whether you're using a surrogate key or a natural key, all of those sorts of things. And so anyways, we'll have these resources available. We'll have some links available for you to take a look at if that's something you'd like to consider. But it's a really neat new feature that we've got in here. On new projects, it's something that we plan on using pretty much across the board. Next up is failover and mirroring. Now, I'm not going to demo this right now, but just to let you know, we've had support for failover and mirroring in SQL Server. what we've done basically is we made it so that you can adjust some of the timeouts in relation to it. In certain circumstances, we didn't necessarily deal real well with situations where the timeout took longer than expected, and so basically we've beefed up some of the support in relation to failover, and we also allow you to set a connection timeout. This setting is available, I believe, in MS SQL Server, and but like for Oracle, this setting is controlled by the server. It's not in the client. So the connection timeout, I believe, was implemented across MySQL, MS SQL, and Postgres. Oracle, you don't have control of that. But just that setting alone really improved the failover and mirroring, because if the server took longer than expected to fail over, you can now have an extended time period for that so that it works better. So that's one of those situations for your environment and for your servers. You should really test against that if you have this sort of setup to basically give you better reliability in relation to that. So, and that is a Mertech INI setting that we have there. The next thing we're going to talk about is the VDF Embedded SQL Syntax. Now, in relation to Embedded SQL, Mertech has actually had since the beginning Embedded SQL support. And Embedded SQL support is really something that's always been there to complement the native record-based support of DataFlex code. And you know, the driver is always focused on making DataFlex code as fast as possible in relation to your database. But sometimes there are situations where using embedded SQL, stored procedures on the server, things like that, really are the proper solution for your application. And in that case, we've had those commands since the beginning. What we've added in now is the ability to use the classes that data access has in place, the SQL.pkg classes, against our driver. Now, you're not actually using SQL.pkg, we have a replacement for it, but it provides you with the same interface. And so with very little code changes, you're able to, if you're possibly looking at moving from the data access driver to Mertech driver, there's very little code changes that are needed now to make that work. So I'm going to show you how this works. Okay, so in the specialized components area, which is one of the example workspaces that data access has, I've gone through and actually I've already made a couple of the adjustments to this stored procedure ODBC call. That's one I'm going to illustrate with you here. And basically this is showing, you'll see here that we have this object handler, and I'll show you where my code changes are. The first code change we made was, of course, to remove the data access packages and put in our Flex2SQL package. Even in relation to this, the class names are the same though. This is the code that was there before for the connection string, and I had to tweak the connection string to tell it that we're using the Mertech driver and to give it the data, or excuse me, the server name. And then the other thing that I added in here, in the data access driver, some of the information about the database is stored in this example, was stored in a file DSN. And so I added in the actual database that we're connecting to here. And then since I'm working against our order entry database, I changed the database name to match also. And there were a couple other minor changes made for things that actually you don't have to worry about. Future versions will make those the same. There was a column name that's slightly different. But other than those things, all the rest of the code, if you go and pull this up now, is identical code to what data access has. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and we will pull up this example. Now this example calls, if you'll notice here, it calls the SP help stored procedure, which is a built-in stored procedure on SQL Server actually that returns a whole bunch of details about a table. And so this is actually a pretty hardy test to run against because there are multiple result sets, all kinds of stuff gets returned. So here we go. You can see here we get back 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 result sets in this case, giving me details, various details about the table. And so in this case, we're running this and getting back the exact same thing we would get back if we were running on the data access driver for this stored procedure call. And it works in exactly the same way. We can run it over and over again. And if you'll notice in here, it's essentially opening a statement, setting some arguments, doing the call, and then basically looping over all of the return values and various attributes of those return values. So this is something that our driver could do with commands before, and now with these classes in place, you're able to just use them as is. Now, what's the advantage of these classes? Well, the big advantage in relation for most people is that you get this help right here, mouse over help, statement completion help in the IDE. That's something that VDF has built in for packages, and so all of that is, you get access to all of that from the IDE natively. So that ends up being a big help for some people. And of course, if you have a lot of code based on SQL.pkg, you're able to use it against our driver with very little work. So it's just another one of those things that can help you get some of your work done a little bit quicker if this is a environment that you're already used to programming in. So one of the advantages to the Flex2SQL packages that we have is that it works across all of Mertech's drivers. So you can take code that maybe was in data access driver against a SQL server and run it against Mertech's driver in a Postgres environment if you were to migrate over to PostgreSQL while still using the same SQL.pkg code just by replacing the use statement at the top. So it ends up making things real easy to move that way. The next feature we're going to look at is actually a change in the way we deal with stored procedures in our Mertech Inc. file. Now, in prior versions of Mertech Inc., the way stored procedures were called, there were actually quite a few different ways to call them, and some of them were dependent on which driver you were using. And based on the driver, the syntax could be slightly different, and there were just some things that were a little bit different from driver to driver. In 12.1, we've unified this call interface, and so basically there are two main methods to use here. One of them is the call stored procedure, which essentially gives you a one-line method of calling a stored procedure on the server that works across all of the database drivers. So if you happen to have an environment where you're using multiple drivers and you're having to do various things to decide which driver was being used and adjust the stored procedure interface, that's now gone. You can use the same interface all the way across. The second method is basically just an alternate way of doing the same thing. SQL set procedure name is a multi-command method, and actually I'll show you what it looks like here. So SQL set procedure name, you pass it the name of the stored procedure and the number of parameters, and then you have the ability to set the parameters in this fashion on multiple lines. Now, the reason some people may want to use this is, for instance, if the parameters may be coming out of an array stored somewhere and they don't know the array indexes or things like that, you have the ability to, of course, put this inside of a loop to set all of your procedure parameters, whereas if it was on a using the call stored procedure method, everything would have to be on one line together. So basically we give you a real simple one, and then this one a little bit more advanced that gives you access to break it out based on your programming environment. And so basically, this test code that I have here illustrates also our SQL set function, which has been modified also, so it works for procedures and functions. And so I have this in a procedure here, and you'll notice this little bit of code down here. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm connecting to 4 different servers, MySQL, SQL Flex, MS SQL, or Oracle, and Postgres, and running the exact same code against all 4 of them. Just the same procedure, we run it against all 4 of them, and it works perfectly. So it gives you that ability to have that unified code across there. One of the other things that we did along with this was that we deprecated some of the other command usages, the very specific 2A driver commands. They all still work, but we're advising that for new development, you use these unified stored procedures. And realistically, it just makes it a little bit easier for you from a code perspective, knowing what to expect. And you'll notice that I mentioned that you may need to adjust your code, and this is in fact the case even if you're using some of the older stored procedure methods. So if you compile your application against the 12.1 Mertech Inc. and you use the 12.1 driver, those are a matched pair now. You can't use the new Mertech Inc. against an old driver, although you can use the new driver against an old Mertech Inc. So if you go and put your the new 12.1 driver in place of a version 12 or 11, don't recompile your application. It'll work perfectly, and you get access to, for instance, the connection timeout feature. If you want to use some of the newer features that we've added into Mertech Inc., you need to make sure that you're doing both of these things. And if you're using out-based parameters, or on call stored procedure, there's the SQL out parameter. If you're using either of those to define parameters that are either only out-based or returned parameters, or bidirectional parameters, in-out parameters, you now need to specify that. Before, they would come back in either case, and it was advised that you specified it. Now you actually need to specify it to get those values back. So it's a minor change that way, but something to be aware of. And the documentation on that has more information in that area. Next up is the data migration utility. So we've made some visual improvements in the data migration utility and also some functional improvements, and so I want to show those to you now. There's been a few things that have changed that way, but probably the biggest item is the restructure feature. So if I go and select multiple tables here, users, let's not do sys, let's do users, vendors, inventory, say restructure. You'll notice that at the top here, I get it mentions table 1 of 3, and I can go through and let's just go in and add some fields here. So we're going to add a created on in each of these. Just a very simple one in that case. Okay, so now we get this cool little table structure at the end that shows us. Now we can either just commit the changes and be done with it, but we now have, of course, we've got this ability to actually see what's going to occur on the server for each one of the tables here. You can see that it's just, in this case, adding a created on each of these, what the adjustments in the int file would be, and also source code for it. But one of the cool things you can do here is I can say save all in one script, and okay, so if you were doing extensive changes, for instance, and wanted to be able to run those on the server or send them to another server or whatever the case may be, you can save all of those changes off to a file rather than committing them locally. And if you have some process that you work with in relation to your changes, you can script all of those together now, which is a really cool feature for if you are an ISV, for instance, and maybe distributing stuff, and don't have a built-in utility to deal with structure updating. This now can be used in an ad hoc fashion like that. So that's one of the new features that we have in there. There's also been a couple other things. If we were to go into the convert tab here, before there was always the need, if when you were converting a database, if you'd go in here and look at the fields, it always scrolled off the edge of the screen, or in almost every case it did, and it didn't look very good overall, and could be a little bit difficult to use. What we've done now is we've adjusted this down a little bit and moved some of the options that were before in a table off to these what we're calling sidecar fields here. These sidecar fields, let you get to those items very easily, and it gets rid of some of the scrolling issues that we had before in there. And you can now tell if the various options that you have in here are options that you can change, whereas before it could be difficult to tell on some of that stuff. So it just made that a little bit easier and friendly to use. There's also been some other changes in here that you'll notice as you go through. I won't go over some of those. They're a little bit more minor, but it's just we've added in some conveniences, fixed some things to make them look a little bit better and act the way you might expect. So, just trying to make the migration utility a little bit friendlier to use. So this SQL script option, though, I think a lot of people, I know certainly for me, when I'm going through and adjusting stuff that way, it ends up being really useful just in the last couple of days as I've been playing with the feature, being able to grab the SQL script for changes on various tables and, for instance, run some of this stuff against SQL Azure even, as I'm working with that, since they have a little bit different environment on how you handle things there. The next thing to look at is our support utility. Now, the support utility has been in the product just for a version or two now. And basically, this is, let me show it to you. The support utility is run as part of the installation, in fact. But as you're dealing with various VDF versions, essentially it sees what version of the Mertech drivers you have installed. And of course, some of those drivers require some other libraries associated with them. They have help files. Instead of having to manually copy those items over into your VDF installation, this utility will do it for you, and in fact it'll show you what you're at. So I can see right now that my 16.1, 17.0, and 17.1 VDF installations all have the latest driver, but my 15.1 doesn't. So I can tell it to go ahead and copy the drivers in there, and it will do that for me. And now those drivers are good to go with the licenses and everything associated with them for my 15.1 installation. And what we've really changed for 12.1 in relation to this is, if I were to go in here, I've already got it in 17.0. I can come in here, and the Flex2SQL package, our new SQL replacement package, is now included. I don't have it as part of this workspace workspace. It's part of the VDF installation, so any workspace I go to has access to this, and also to Mertech Inc. So you no longer have to worry about copying those into a specific workspace or whatever. They get copied into your VDF installation for you by the support utility. In addition to that, if I were to go take a look in here, actually, I think I would have to go into the 16.1. You'll notice some of these other files that are here. This MDS MySQL, MDS PGSQL with these numbers on the end and all of that. Basically, the support utility will, rather than just replacing what's there, it essentially backs up what was there in relation to our driver, including the CFG files for all of them. And all of that stuff stays in that folder so that you have the ability to uninstall with the support utility. So if you pass a command line option to, I believe the command line option's in the documentation. I think it's just minus uninstall to the support utility. You can actually back out what you've done. So for instance, if you use this utility and overwrite your version 3.0 Mertech Inc. And you don't want to get your application dealing with the SQL out, for instance, when you run the support utility to copy it over, you can also back out, and it will restore your prior Mertech Inc. that you had. So we've just kind of beefed that up. We use this utility internally all the time for various things too. It's the easiest way to get your installation in the proper shape. So if that's not something you're using right now, you definitely should. The last item from 12.1 to go over with you is documentation. So let me pull up some help here. Oh, let's see. So I'm going to go to this one right here. So this is a work in progress right now. For 12.1, we are doing an overhaul on all of the Mertech documentation in relation to attributes and commands. Before we had examples that weren't quite correct to the attribute that was there, or the explanation wasn't very clear on it. And so we're going through and basically cleaning all of that up so that when you go and look for an attribute or look for documentation on an attribute or command, you're going to get an example that you could easily work through with a full explanation of the effects it has. And like for instance, in some of the cases, even information on if that option is available in your int file. So the reason I bring up this example, as we've gone through here, we've also been tweaking some things to make them a little bit easier for you to use. This option, df file get server name from login, it actually is kind of backwards for what it does. The name on this property or of this attribute didn't quite fit very well. And so what we actually did was we deprecated this command. You'll see that it's marked as deprecated. The description is correct on it. And it even makes a note that the logic is a bit backwards on this one. But in related commands, you'll see a new attribute, df file suppress server name output. So in this case, the name is much more clear as to what it does. And you'll see that basically this command, if you use it with this example, in the case of a customer table, if you set this attribute to true on the customer file, and you output the int file, you would expect that the server name is going to be suppressed. The default for it, of course, is false, and so the server name would get written into your int file using this output int command. So basically, as we've gone through here, if there are other issues that we can address in Mertech Inc., we're addressing those along the way, correcting the documentation, making it a little bit easier for you to use, and trying to make it so that you don't get stuck on something if you're trying to use maybe a little bit more advanced feature of the driver. So, and that's involved not only the descriptions, but also the examples of the commands and attributes. And you'll see in the next beta that a whole bunch more of that has been completed. So for the actual release of 12.1, our plan is to have all of that completed. So that is the last feature that we have here. So if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them for you now, or if anyone wants to ask about some specific item that I showed, please feel free to. So I got a question from Todd asking, when will this be available? I believe if I go past here, if you want to participate in the beta, you can shoot an email off to support@mertechdata.com, and the beta is available now. So we'll send you a download link so that you can try this out. So it's available. It was available actually as of Monday of this week was when we had it ready. So just shoot off an email and we'll get back to you this morning still, or this afternoon, depending on where you are. If you haven't seen, go ahead.
Yeah, just show us the new Mertech.inc and the work that you guys have put into that.
Sure.
Because the new Mertech.inc will ship alongside the old Mertech.inc will be named in a different way.
Yeah, in the beta right now, it ships the new one and essentially leaves your old one alone. So if I go in here, for instance, even just on this, we've always had these documentation comments, but before you would just see all of these defines together, just sitting there for all of these various attributes. We've now gone and tested all of them, of course, to confirm functionality, and then written notes, and essentially our help system is built out of this. So we have all of these notes in here. You'll notice that they're kind of marked up, and so all of these get brought into the help system directly from here. So it ends up being, if you keep Mertech Inc. open and look at it while you when you're developing, you can certainly just search for options in here and see the same documentation that's in our doc files. So as you can see here, they've been working on the examples with all of this stuff. Most of the attributes are completed as of right now, and we're moving on to the commands now. So, and all of the syntax items, actually, that was one of the items in here that was kind of funky. The syntax for get attribute and set attribute was normally it showed that you could pass all kinds of other stuff to it that just wasn't supported by get and set attributes. So all of the actual syntax, parameter descriptions, and all of that have been updated as well. And you'll see, like, for instance, something new that we're working on, in fact, in here. On this one, df file gets schema name from login. It talks about, where the schema name is retrieved from. But one of the things that you'll see in here, we have this new int option tag, basically, called schema name. In future versions, you'll be able to actually see all of the various possible int options and their associated attributes from Mertech Inc. so that, sometimes they are not quite named the same. For instance, on, let's see here. on some related to like the database name, for instance. They're quite a bit different between what you use in Mertech Inc. and what you use in the int file for it. So by relating those two, it'll make it a little bit easier for you to see what's going on that way.
So Oliver, I have another question for you, and this pertains to the use of UUID fields. With this new support with a new ID value and all of that, how does it put that in the context of using it as a row ID in a standard quote-unquote DataFlex table?
So yeah, essentially this gives you it gives you an option other than using a row ID. I mean, the row ID is something that still gets generated, but it's somewhat of a proprietary interface from the standpoint of how it's generated. So if you were in some way dependent on serializing your row IDs, for instance, to the client, this ends up being a little bit more generalized and open approach using the UUIDs rather than a a serialized row ID. This is always going to be unique, and it doesn't give away any information or anything like that from your table, and so it ends up working out real well in place of a row ID actually. So we've actually been using UUIDs for quite some time now on consulting projects even, and so we've had a very successful time of it with being able to just work with them as from anywhere without any problem. If you do some searches online for this sort of stuff, you'll see all kinds of like for instance on this page, it's a bit unruly possibly from some standpoints because of it being such a long string from a debugging standpoint, but in general I haven't found that to be a problem, and there are so many advantages to it. It mentions here cumbersome to debug, but in general the pros definitely outweigh the cons in relation to this. We got a question from Chuck. Let's see. I noticed you had SQL set procedure with the underscores, whereas I use a SQL set procedure without underscores. Any reason if you have a compatible interface? Well, in relation to that, those are the commands, and replacing the command interface with something different. We actually already had a SQL set procedure name for quite some time, and so we wanted to keep compatibility with that without having to rename or deal with anything in that fashion. So all of our other commands followed that sequence, so we did the same in this case. And in relation to commands, with classes, it's a little bit easier to basically just replace a class username with commands. A lot of times they're not in a package, but are in an inc file and maybe precompiled and things like that. So it kind of helps to not have a name collision on a command in that case. We got a question from Rich Miller. How would you handle synchronization of SQL Azure VDF database to local database? So if you're using Azure, in general, you don't have a local database. They're selling you essentially an all-in solution in most cases. You're going to be, they want you to host your application on the Azure cloud environment, and they want you to host your database there. From the standpoint of how you can get your data from one place to another, they have these, they call them backpack files that you can generate in newer versions of SQL, and you can take that backpack file, which is basically a backup of your database, and upload that onto Azure to get that database running there. So that's kind of the advised method. It takes a little bit of work to get going, but that's what they want you to do. As for other synchronization, if you wanted to do something that way, essentially you'd have to roll your own. There really isn't anything out there right now that will do that that I've seen, at least in an automatic fashion. You can't replicate or anything like that from a local database to an Azure database in real time. And we have another question here. This is from Clive. He asks, if you need to generate a UUID on the client side, is this easy to do? It actually is fairly easy to do. Let's see. Don't know if I have the code on this virtual machine for that. It actually isn't very difficult. What we did in one case before we had this, the 12.1 driver to use, is that we created we added it into our data dictionary subclass layer so that it could do some of this automatically, of course. And there is some API calls. In fact, I think even on the data access support forums, Vincent or maybe someone else had written something, one of the blog posts that showed one possible way of generating UUIDs. There are actually a few different ways of doing it. So, but yeah, it's not very difficult. I think the package is probably 10 or 15 lines of code, and then for use, yeah, you're looking at one line from that standpoint. The nice thing about our driver in relation to this is that we are storing it in the native format. So when you save it in there, it's going to be saved as a 128-bit integer, whereas the alternative solution that people have used, and like for instance with the data access drivers, in general you need to have it as a string, and you end up with I don't know, it's like a 38-byte string. So you generate it as a string in VDF, and then save it into the database, and the driver converts it into that 128-bit integer. So it ends up working out real nice that way.
Oliver, I have one more question for you.
Okay.
If you were planning to move to Azure, how would you handle migrating an existing database onto Azure?
So if I was going to do that, I would definitely use their backpack method. I mean, it is the advised method. There are other ways. One of the other ways I've seen people do it, and that I played with, was to essentially script tables out and import them in to Azure that way. Their utilities for the backpack files deal with users, deal with your stored procedures. They deal with everything, though. So that's really the way to do it. I would back up that entire database, take it onto there. From the standpoint of your application, it ends up being pretty easy, because if you wanted to access that database remotely, there's some stuff set up on Azure in relation to like firewalling and things like that they give you wizards for. But then after that, it's basically as simple as changing the login in your application, if that's how you do it, or possibly doing a global search and replace in your int files. If that's the setup that you have to replace the server name, and that's all there is to it. It actually is pretty simple, because it is treated as a first-class database. There isn't anything weird you need to do. If you're using certain features of SQL Server that aren't supported by Azure, of course you're going to be in a little bit more difficult situation. They limit access to certain areas. For instance, you don't have access to the master database, for instance, and you also are required to have a clustered index. There are various things that are slightly different. Most databases are just going to fit without any problem, though, with a backpack restore.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, then I think we should bring this to a conclusion. Thank you all for participating. We'll have the recording available, and I think if anybody needs the recording, please send us an email, and we'll be happy to provide that for you. Thank you, Oliver, again for an excellent presentation.
Thank you guys all for joining us this morning. Shoot an
Bye.
email off and we'll get you that data. Have a good day.